My name is Ted. I won't use the cave's real name or my friends, so I'll call them Mystery Cave and B. The place is dangerous, and I have no intention of helping curious strangers find it. B and I had been caving for several years. On December 30th, 2000, we wanted one last trip before New Year's. Mystery Cave was familiar territory, and neither of us expected to discover anything new. We were not the first people to explore Mystery Cave. Dust, boot prints, and even a little litter marked the easiest chambers. Everything about that part of the system suggested familiar, well-traveled ground. The entrance lies beneath a low cliff. First comes a rope descent of roughly 50 feet. Beyond that are cramped crawls, sharp rock, and a series of passages that either close against solid walls or sink into underground pools. That day, we followed the widest gallery down to its lowest point. I wanted another look at a shallow recess we had passed over on earlier visits. At that stage, we had no reason to expect anything unusual there. At the back of the recess, about 3 feet above the floor, was a hole scarcely wider than my fist. I had to kneel beneath a shelf of rock before I could examine it closely. The moment I leaned closer, cold air touched my face. We were hot from the descent, so there was no mistaking that draft. The current was coming directly through the small hole in front of me. I fed a small flashlight through the opening. The wall was only a few inches thick. Beyond it, the beam picked out a crawlway so low it seemed almost flat, extending 10 or 12 feet before the ceiling appeared to rise. In a cave, moving air often points to another entrance or a larger system. From what little the flashlight showed us, the passage did seem to open beyond the tightest section. B stretched out beside me and took a look for himself. For several minutes, we shifted the light, measured the wall, and tried to make out what lay farther in. Before we had even started back to the surface, we were already listing the tools we would bring on our next trip. Hard, compact rock surrounded the opening. Our plan was to drill a ring of holes, then break away the stone with a sledge and a steel punch. We thought 1 or 2 trips would be enough. We came back near the end of January with a cordless drill, spare batteries, masonry bits, and 2 small sledges. It took almost an hour to haul all of the equipment down to the recess. At each difficult stretch, one of us went ahead, while the other lowered the packs to him on a rope. There was only room to work on our knees, hunched beneath the shelf. The drill overheated quickly. Dust fell into our faces and pasted itself to our sweat. We would bore a hole, drive in the punch, and hammer at it, often to free a chip of rock no bigger than a fingernail. The noise wore us down. While one of us hammered, the other lay a little farther back in the darkness, waiting for his turn. We kept at it until every battery was dead. By evening, the opening had gained a few inches. It was still far too small for a head or shoulder. We slept in a motel, recharged the equipment, and returned the next morning. At the end of the second day, no one could have squeezed through. Those tiny gains did not discourage us at first. Every fragment we removed made the hidden space feel more real. We were always one good day's work from breaking through. Then the next trip came, and we were still 1 day away. Then another. I eventually named the crawlway Floyd's Tomb, after Floyd Collins, the explorer who died trapped in a passage too narrow to release him. At the time, the name made us laugh. The name simply described the place where we spent our weekends, kneeling before a hole that refused to let us in. During those first work sessions, a low rumble would sometimes rise from beyond the wall without any obvious cause.
A road used by heavy trucks ran somewhere nearby, so we assumed their vibrations were traveling through the rock. That explanation worked for us until the same rumble came when no vehicle was passing on the road above. B asked other cavers about it. They told him an underground river or waterfall could create that kind of rumble. That remained possible, although the sound came and went without any pattern we could detect. The draft was more reliable. As the opening grew, the air moved through it with greater force. It streamed between our tools and sometimes made the rough edges of the hole vibrate until they gave off a faint, mournful sound. After several trips spent widening the outer wall, we began scraping down the floor inside. The entrance itself was nearly large enough, but a low point farther in still barred the way. There, the ceiling dropped so close to the ground that I doubted my chest would fit, even with my lungs completely empty. At home, I built an adjustable wooden box. I lay face down inside it with my arms at my sides, while B lowered the lid a little at a time. We determined that I needed about 8 inches of clearance to move. That meant shaving down the entire low section of the crawlway. On one trip, B brought his dog, Whip. She was a small, high-spirited terrier who had followed us through Mystery Cave before. Normally, she investigated every crevice, ran back to check on us, then darted ahead again. Nothing underground had ever frightened her. This time, she stopped running the moment we entered the passage that led to the hole. At first, I assumed the descent had tired her. She no longer ranged ahead and stayed close to B's legs. About 60 feet from the recess, she stopped altogether. The fur along her back lifted. B called to her. She took 2 steps, then crouched behind B with her tail pressed beneath her belly. We had talked about sending her through the crawlway once the entrance was wide enough. Her reaction immediately ended that idea. While we worked, Whip remained on top of one of the packs, staring at the hole. She trembled. Whenever the drill stopped, her ears rose as though she were listening to something on the other side of the wall. B was swinging the sledge when he froze halfway through the motion. "Did you hear that?" I had heard nothing. He described a scraping sound, like a large stone being dragged across another, somewhere beyond the crawlway. We switched off the drill and waited. A cave is never truly silent. Water fell somewhere in the system. Fabric rasped against stone, and the sound of our own breathing became absurdly loud whenever we stopped talking. I heard nothing else. B went back to work. A few minutes later, he set down the sledge and turned toward the opening again. Once more, the sound had passed me by. I managed to put my head through the hole to inspect the section we still had to lower. My shoulders remained outside. I was studying the roof of the crawlway when I realized the draft had stopped. The draft had been strong enough to cool our faces all morning. Now, nothing moved. I reached into the passage, then held a small flame near the opening to catch the slightest current. The air remained perfectly still. The rumbling had stopped as well. B and I stayed in front of the hole for a long time, unable to explain it. Whip never left the pack and kept staring at the opening. None of our explanations accounted for that silence. In the end, we gathered our equipment earlier than planned. On the way out, Whip stayed against B until we had left that gallery behind. Only then, as though we had crossed some boundary, did she begin to run again.
By our next trip, the draft had returned. We decided its disappearance had meant nothing unusual and resumed the work. I knelt at the opening in safety glasses and earplugs, pressing my weight into the drill as the bit shuddered against stone. B suddenly struck my shoulder. I released the trigger, pulled out the earplugs and raised my head. Even after the drill fell silent, a scream was still rising through the crawlway in front of us. The scream seemed to begin deep in the cave and roll toward us. There was something human in it, but the pitch climbed too high and the sound lasted too long. At times, it sounded more like an animal caught in a trap. The sound weakened, returned in the echo, then died away. B and I faced the opening without speaking. My light reached as far as the bend, but nothing moved anywhere inside that narrow strip of light. We pushed loose stones into the crawlway to make a barrier. B thought an animal might be living beyond the wall and trying to come out. I wanted to believe him, but no animal I knew could make a sound like that. We waited for another cry. None came. Eventually, we picked up the tools again. I wish I could explain that choice as courage, or even as calm judgment. The truth is that we had already given too many hours to that hole. While the drill was running, we could concentrate on the rock and push every other thought aside. So we kept working until the batteries were empty. Over the next few trips, we lowered the floor farther. There was now enough room for my shoulders, then my hips. Only the tightest point remained. On April 7th, after 2 more hours of scraping, I finally decided to try going through. I taped my t-shirt in place so it could not ride up my back. I removed my helmet, kept a small light in one hand, and slid both arms ahead of me. B stood directly behind my feet. The first few inches were easier than I expected. Rock dragged across my shoulders and hips, but I could still move my arms. I pushed forward until my shoes vanished from the outer gallery. From that point on, B could no longer help me. The crawlway had swallowed nearly my entire body, and all I could see in front of my face was a narrow strip of dusty stone. I drove myself onward with the tips of my boots. Chips we had broken loose rolled beneath my chest and pressed deeper into my skin with every movement. Then my back met the ceiling and stopped me cold. I tried to continue, but my ribcage wedged between the floor and the rock above. Each breath tightened the pressure. When I exhaled, it eased just enough to buy another inch or two. I stopped and forced my breathing under control. I could still back out, but only if I found the exact angle at which I had entered. By then, B could see nothing but the soles of my boots. His voice reached me muffled and distant, as if he were speaking from another room. I emptied my lungs slowly and pushed with my toes. My body slid forward. After one shallow breath, the rock closed against my chest again. I waited for the panic to settle, breathed out, and repeated the movement. Each effort carried me only a few inches. I could not raise my head. One cheek scraped the floor, while the other nearly touched the ceiling. The draft moved across my face, carrying dust back toward the opening. After several more pushes, my hand found open space. I worked one arm beneath my chest, lifted a shoulder, and felt the ceiling rise at last. A few moments later, I was on my hands and knees. Floyd's tomb was behind me. B's voice still carried through the crawlway. I told him I was fine, although my breathing probably told a different story. He passed my helmet, camera, and a small pack through to me on a rope. The passage had barely admitted me. B did not think he could clear the lowest point, so he would remain at the entrance and wait for me to return. The risk in that decision was obvious. If anything happened,
B would not be able to reach me. I allowed myself a few seconds to think about that, then went on. After weeks of staring into the passage from outside, I was finally beyond it and unwilling to turn back.
The first corridor ran for about 20 feet. I still had to crawl, but the ceiling rose after the bend. In the next passage, which was nearly twice as long, I gradually came off my knees until I could move almost upright. This part of the cave was unlike any gallery we knew. No boots had dulled the stone. Delicate formations remained unbroken. The floor crackled beneath me, and no trail crossed it until I made one. I called to B at regular intervals. Beyond the second bend, I already had to shout to hear his answer. We agreed that I would explore for half an hour, then come back, whether the cave continued or not. Along the right wall, I found layers of transparent crystal. They hung like frozen wax and ended in small points. One formation had snapped close to its base. I searched the floor, but could not find the missing piece. The detail unsettled me, though it proved nothing. A formation could break on its own, and the fragment might have rolled into a crack. I moved on. Roughly 100 feet farther in, the passage turned sharply to the left. Beyond the bend, the passage opened into a chamber large enough for me to stand upright at last. The roof climbed 15 feet or more overhead. Across the room, another opening led deeper into the dark. Near the entrance, a large, almost round boulder leaned against the wall. Every other block around it was jagged and irregular. This one looked as though it had been placed there, even though I knew nature can produce shapes with a disturbing kind of order. The moment I entered the chamber, my excitement vanished. The room appeared empty, and nothing looked dangerous. Even so, I had the unmistakable feeling that something had noticed me. I swept the walls with my light and called B, but no answer came. My time was running short. I photographed the boulder, the ceiling, and the opening on the far side. Then, as I followed the chamber's left wall, I found a drawing traced into the stone at eye level. Its color almost disappeared into the stone. Several crude human figures stood beneath a larger symbol, their arms raised toward it. I stayed in front of that drawing longer than I care to admit. If a human hand had made the drawing, someone had reached the chamber another way. Floyd's tomb had been too narrow before we opened it. There might therefore be a second entrance, collapsed or concealed somewhere beyond the chamber. I tried to hold on to that explanation. Yet, as I studied those figures, I kept thinking about the untouched floor and the broken crystal whose missing tip I could not find. My half hour was nearly gone. I photographed the drawing, gave the far passage one final look, and started back toward Floyd's tomb. When I reached the constriction, I lowered myself to the ground and prepared to crawl out. Before I could enter the constriction, a scraping sound rang out behind me. Something heavy had shifted across the floor of the chamber I had just left. This time, I heard it as clearly as B had during those first work sessions. I did not wait to hear it again. Going out head first proved harder than entering. I stretched my arms ahead, forced my shoulders into the opening, and let B pull as soon as he could reach my wrists. Once I was back in the familiar gallery, I sat beside him until my breathing steadied. The scraping still troubled me, but the relief of finally crossing the passage soon took over. I had found an untouched cave, a high chamber, and a drawing that might point to another entrance. Back home, I had the photographs developed. Every picture taken in the first passages came back perfectly clear. Every frame from the chamber, the boulder, the ceiling, the drawing, was blank. although the shots immediately before and after were properly exposed. I redrew the symbol from memory. Then B began looking for someone slender enough to go through Floyd's tomb with me. He found a volunteer a few days later. I'll call him Joe. Joe was an experienced caver and more lightly built than I was. We said nothing about the scream, the scraping, or Whip's behavior. Each event still seemed open to an ordinary explanation, and we did not want to frighten him before we even went underground. Joe slipped through Floyd's tomb with almost insulting ease. I followed. As I rose on the far side, I forgot that my helmet was still in the pack and drove the top of my head into the roof hard enough to split my scalp. I sat there dazed while Joe checked the wound. It was not bleeding badly, but the pain kept building. Eventually I admitted that going any farther would be foolish. My own exploration had ended there. Joe had crossed the entire cave to see the new section. He asked for directions, so I described the first two passages, the crystals, and the chamber with the round boulder, without adding anything about the sounds. We agreed on a strict time limit, and Joe went on alone. His light disappeared around the first bend. I crawled back to B, where we cleaned the cut and waited for Joe to return. The minutes stretched. No footsteps, no voice, no sound at all came back through the cave to tell us where he was. When he missed the time we had agreed upon, B shouted for him and received no answer. I began collecting my gear, ready to go after him despite the injury. At last, a glow appeared in the crawlway. It advanced in sharp, uneven jolts, accompanied by the rapid scrape of a body moving over stone. "Joe, are you all right?" "No." He said nothing more. His pack came through first. Then Joe forced himself into the low section and emerged without waiting for our help. Dust covered his face. Small cuts marked his cheeks and forearms. He was breathing too quickly, and his eyes stayed wide, as if he could not risk losing sight of the gallery behind us. We asked what had happened. He said he felt sick and wanted to get out. He left before we had finished packing. Outside, he was still trembling. He insisted he had gone only a short distance, but he had not heard us calling, which meant he had passed at least the first bends. I asked about the crystals. He said he had not seen them. The round boulder, the chamber, the drawing, his answer was the same each time. He barely spoke during the drive home. Over the next few days, Joe stopped answering his phone. He missed work and sent word that he would be away for a while. B and I still had no idea what he had encountered inside the cave. The less Joe was willing to discuss it, the harder it became for us to let the question go. We finally decided to return to the chamber with a video camera and a way to communicate through the rock. I borrowed a field telephone from a cave rescue team. It was designed for underground use. B would keep one handset at the entrance to Floyd's tomb, while I carried the other, paying out a thin cable behind me. We could speak even after the bends swallowed our voices. I also sealed a video camera inside a protective housing. I wanted a record of the galleries, the drawing, and whatever lay beyond the chamber. This time, we could review the footage as soon as we returned, instead of trusting another roll of film. The descent fought us from the beginning. Knots jammed, packs snagged on the walls, and several pieces of equipment slipped from our hands. None of that was unusual. The real problem lay elsewhere. The closer we came to Floyd's tomb, the stronger my urge to turn around became. By the time we reached it, the feeling was almost overwhelming. I did not mention it to B. At the crawlway, we tested the telephone. His voice came through perfectly. I went in carrying the cable, the camera, my main lamp, and 2 backup lights.
Nothing happened on the way to the chamber. I filmed the formations, the crystals, the boulder, and the drawing. Through the viewfinder, every image looked normal. Once I had recorded them, I crossed the room. I entered the passage I had not yet explored. The roof was high enough for me to move in a crouch. The walls were darker than elsewhere in the cave, and the ceiling formed an almost regular arch. After 100 feet, it bent right. I stopped to call B. The line was clear. He asked whether everything was all right. I told him it was and said I would continue a little farther. At that moment, the signal remained perfectly steady. I put down the handset, set the camera in front of me, and began filming the bend. The scraping exploded behind my back, so close that I spun around and tried to stand in one movement. My helmet struck the ceiling. The main lamp shattered on impact, and a bolt of pain ran from my neck to the middle of my back. I dropped to my knees in total darkness. For several seconds I could do nothing. I heard only my breathing, my heartbeat, and the quiet slide of the cable against the stone. My first backup light still worked, but its batteries were nearly spent. It cast a yellow circle less than 3 feet wide. I searched the pack for my glow sticks. The first had cracked. The second released a weak green light around my hands. I snapped another and threw it toward the chamber. As it flew, the light swept across the drawing and the round boulder without catching any movement. The stick landed behind the rock, where most of its glow vanished. I plugged in the telephone. The line was dead. I pulled the connector, checked it, and tried again. Nothing. Only minutes earlier, B's voice had been as clear as an ordinary phone call. The only way out lay on the far side of the chamber. I sat against the wall, unable to make myself move. My lamp was dimming. My feet began to go numb, and the pain in my back was getting worse. Waiting would only consume what little light I had left. I had to move. I gripped the cable with both hands and started forward. Broken stone cracked beneath my boots. I lit the floor, then the drawing, then the space around the boulder. The chamber still appeared empty. A few yards from the rock, I understood what had been bothering me since I entered. The round boulder was no longer in its former position. It had rolled across the telephone cable and pinned it to the floor. I pulled gently. The wire held fast. When I pulled harder, it snapped. Behind the boulder, close to the ground, an opening was now exposed. The rock had concealed it until then. The passage descended at a steady angle. It was roughly 3 feet across, wide enough for a person to move through without difficulty. The glow stick I had thrown had rolled inside. Its green light revealed walls that looked almost smooth before the shaft disappeared into darkness. The scraping had come from the boulder moving. I could see nothing that might have moved it. I left the telephone on the floor. The camera was behind me in the corridor where my lamp had broken, and I abandoned that too. All I wanted was to reach B.
I moved back through the galleries as quickly as my injured back allowed. I no longer turned the light toward the walls. Every bit of it stayed fixed on the passage ahead. When I was finally close enough to call out, B answered. I shouted for him to gather the equipment and begin the climb as soon as I reached him. He asked what had happened. I told him we were not alone. At that moment, the draft grew stronger. It came from the depths of the cave, carrying the smell of wet earth and rotting flesh. I pulled my shirt over my nose. Even through the cloth, every breath made me want to vomit. B could smell it too. He yelled at me to hurry, and I entered Floyd's tomb head first. On the way in, I had controlled every movement. This time, fear had taken the place of caution. I drove forward without protecting my face or arms. The rock tore the skin on my shoulders, ears, and forearms. My back seized with every push, but I kept moving as quickly as the crawlway allowed. At the lowest point, my chest jammed. One cheek rested on chips of stone, the other nearly touched the roof. There was no room for a full breath, while the foul air streamed around me through the crawlway. Far behind me, deep in the new passages, the scraping began again. I do not know where the strength came from. I emptied my lungs, braced with my feet, and drove myself toward the opening with everything I had left. My shoulders reached the opening and stuck. I had to slide back a few inches, turn my chest, and catch the rope B had left within reach. He pulled while I drove with my feet. My upper body broke free, and I fell onto my shoulder in the outer gallery. Blood covered my arms, but I could barely feel the cuts. By the green light of a glow stick, I found my helmet. I followed B to the main shaft, where he had already begun climbing. At the bottom of the vertical rope, I started gathering the length that still ran back into the gallery behind us. It was safer to coil that rope before climbing, so it could not wedge among the rocks. I had pulled in about 50 feet when it suddenly caught somewhere in the direction of Floyd's tomb. I tugged once. The rope resisted, then began sliding back through my hands. It was not moving under its own weight. Something was drawing it into the galleries, toward Floyd's tomb. I let go. I had taken out my harness, but my fingers could no longer close the buckles. I dropped it and threw myself onto the shaft rope without anything that could arrest a fall. B climbed above me. I could hear his boots against the wall and his strained breathing. Beneath my feet, the loose rope continued to slip toward the darkness, drawn back in the direction of the galleries. We reached the final ascent to the surface. There, I managed to attach the device that would catch me if I fell. B had just reached the top when the rope snapped tight below me. The fibers groaned under the strain. I climbed the last few yards without looking down. As soon as my hands reached the rim, B grabbed me and dragged me out. I stripped off the equipment, stumbled toward a tree, and collapsed beside it. We were both coated in dust and cuts. B's face was almost white. One look told me he had been every bit as frightened as I was. A cracking sound made us turn. The knot around the tree was cinching tighter, and the rope stretched taut toward the cave entrance. Something below was pulling it with a steady force that showed no sign of weakening. B drew his knife. It took him only seconds to cut through the rope, but those seconds seemed endless. When the final strands gave way, the end tore free of the tree. It hissed over the rocks, slipped across the edge of the cliff, and vanished into the opening. We stared at the place where it had disappeared. Nothing followed it out. Neither of us spoke on the drive home.
It took me 4 days to put that trip into words. Each time I tried, the smell returned, followed by the rock against my face and the sensation of the rope feeding backward through my hands. I slept in fragments. I could barely eat and was no longer able to work. My supervisor eventually sent me home. A doctor prescribed medication for anxiety. I did not tell him about the cave. At first, writing helped. Setting the events in order, the sound, the broken lamp, the deadline, the shifted boulder, the escape, kept them from happening all at once whenever I closed my eyes. Then, noises began inside the house. A few steps in the next room, something brushing a door, a floorboard creaking at the far end of the hall. Whenever I stopped to listen, the silence returned. I knew what sleep deprivation could do. I also knew that after an experience like ours, the mind could turn any ordinary sound into a threat. For several days, that rational explanation was enough. Soon, I began to catch movement at the edge of my vision, a shape beyond a window, a shadow crossing the hall. Each time I turned my head to look directly at it, nothing remained there. I closed the curtains
and kept every light burning. I bought a handgun. At night, I put off going to bed until exhaustion forced me there. The nightmares, however, had already begun. When I woke, I touched the bedroom wall to prove I was no longer inside Floyd's tomb. 3 weeks after our escape, I saw someone standing at the end of the hallway. The figure remained perfectly still. The lights flickered, and at that same instant the telephone rang in the room behind me. When I looked back, the hall was empty. I grabbed my keys, left the house, and did not look behind me. I do not remember choosing a destination. I drove to an overlook above the city lights. Joe was already there, standing beside his car. He had lost weight, and his face carried the same exhaustion I saw in my own. We made no attempt to describe what we had been seeing at night. Joe only asked whether I had returned to the cave after his trip. I told him about the shifted boulder and the passage hidden behind it. Joe listened without interrupting, then said we had to go back. I did not ask why. After what had been happening to me, I did not need to hear him explain what the cave had left with him. Both of us tried to stay away, but neither found a way back to normal life. Joe believed reaching the passage behind the boulder might finally end the sounds and nightmares. I needed to believe it too. I went to see B. Every light in his house was on. When I told him Joe and I were going back, he asked no questions. He would come with us. We leave in 2 hours. I have packed several lights, fresh batteries, ropes, a first aid kit, food, and water. We are also taking a camera, a notebook, a knife, and my gun. First, I want to recover the camera I abandoned in the passage. If it is still there, and if it kept recording after I ran, it may show us what moved the boulder. Then we will examine the shaft behind it. Joe still has not told me what he saw during his first exploration. B almost never mentions the rope. Yet none of us seems able to stay away from Mystery Cave. I do not know which of us will enter Floyd's tomb first. I do not know how far we will go. I know only that we will stay together, and that this time we will not leave without an answer. I will post the rest when we return. Tonight, if we are not back too late. Tomorrow, at the latest. The journal ends there. No new page appeared after the departure announced for May 19, 2001.